My brother Julian was the kind of man who made silence feel like a judgment. Rooms quieted when he entered them. Horses steadied. Servants stood straighter without being told. He was the Duke of Caldervane, and for 37 years that title had fit him the way a sword fits a scabbard, cleanly, without question. Then one November morning I watched him stand at a farm, widow's gate in the blinding cold of a Harrow-fell winter, 2 small children gripping his coat, and say the 6 words I had never once heard him speak in his life. He said, "I need your help, please." I tell you this because you would not believe the rest of it unless you understood that moment first. The Duke on foot. His carriage snapped at the axle in a ditch half a mile down the frozen road. His London life already half in ruin before the wheel gave way, and those 2 children, his dead brother Roland's children, holding on to him like he was the only solid thing left in the world. Which, for them, he was. He had brought them north to Harrow Fell because there was nowhere else to take them, and no one else who would. And the farmhouse at the end of the lane was the only light they could see in the gray afternoon. The widow had opened her gate without a word. She was perhaps 28, though she looked older in the way that women look older when they have done a man's work alone for 2 years and refused to ask anyone to notice. Her name was Elspeth Caro. Her late husband Nathaniel had left her the farm, the debts, a pair of stout field horses, and 300 acres of frozen fell that she had somehow, bafflingly, kept solvent on her own. She had a daughter of 5 and a son of 3, and she had dark eyes that read a situation the way a solicitor reads a document, quickly, without sentiment, and without missing a thing. She read Julian in about 4 seconds. "How many in your party?" she said. It was not a question. "Myself, 2 children, and my brother." Julian nodded at me. I was standing slightly behind him, holding the younger child, a boy named Thomas who had fallen asleep against my shoulder with complete faith in my structural integrity. "The elder girl is Mara. She is 4. Thomas is 2. Elspeth looked at the children. She looked at Julian. She looked at me. Whatever she thought of the 3 of us, she kept it behind her eyes. "The children can have the settle by the kitchen fire," she said. "There is milk. I will not turn children from a door in November." A beat. "I cannot quarter 2 grown men indefinitely." "I am not asking for indefinitely," Julian said. "I am asking for tonight, and in exchange—" He stopped. He was not accustomed to the shape of that sentence. I watched him find it. "I will work whatever needs doing. I am told there is fencing down along the north pasture." She looked at his hands. They were the hands of a man who had not worked a field in his life, and she could see that plainly. "The fencing has been down since October," she said. "It is frozen into the ground now." "Then I will chip it out." A long silence. The wind came off the fell and cut through all of us. Thomas stirred against my shoulder and did not wake. "Come inside," Elspeth said finally, "before the children take a chill." That was how it began. Not with a negotiation, not with a handshake, not with the kind of formal arrangement that Julian would have been comfortable with. It began with frozen ground, and a widow's grudging mercy, and 2 small children who made her soften before her sensible head could stop her. I should say plainly that I had not intended to stay. I had accompanied Julian north only to see the children safely delivered, and I meant to return to London within the fortnight. But the road south iced over the following week. Julian's carriage was still at the smithy in the village awaiting a new axle, and my horse pulled up lame on the frozen lane. I was stranded at Harrow Fell as surely as my brother was, and so I watched what followed with the peculiar intimacy of a man who has nothing to do but pay attention. Julian worked. I do not mean that he attempted to work, or that he made a reasonable show of effort and then retired to the parlor. I mean that he rose in the dark of the morning, the kitchen still black except for the banked embers, pulled on the heaviest coat he had brought, and went out into the fell. Elspeth's farmhand, old Croft, was a man of 60 with bad knees who had stayed on past his usefulness out of loyalty to Nathaniel Caro's memory, and Julian quietly took from him every task the cold made dangerous. He split wood. He hauled water from the stream before it froze over entirely. He mended the fence along the north pasture with a hammer and a stubbornness that I found both admirable and, frankly, alarming. I asked him on the 3rd morning what he thought he was doing. "Paying my way," he said, not looking up from the fence post he was setting. "You are a duke," I said. "In London," he said. "Here I am a man who ate her bread last night and drank her milk and put his niece and nephew in her spare room. The least I can do is fix her fencing." He was not wrong, but I had known Julian for 35 years, and I had never seen him speak that way, so quietly, without the usual register of authority. Something in him had shifted on the road north. The ruin of his London affairs, the bad investments, the creditors, the mortgaging of the townhouse, the slow unraveling that the scandal sheets had begun to sniff at, had stripped something from him that I thought he could not afford to lose. And yet watching him drive that fence-post home in the bitter cold, I wondered if perhaps he had only lost what was never really his to begin with. Elspeth watched him too. She was careful about it. She watched him the way careful women watch uncertain situations, from the side, from a task that gave her an alibi. She would be bringing in the eggs, and I would see her pause at the corner of the barn, eyes on Julian's back at the fence line. Or she would be at the kitchen window, supposedly attending to the bread, and I would catch her looking out at the field where he had been cutting back the overgrown hedge for the past hour without stopping. She did not soften visibly. That is important to say. Elspeth Caro was not a woman who softened visibly. What changed in her was more subtle than that, the way she set his plate at dinner, gone from perfunctory to almost deliberate, the bread beside it without him having to ask. The way she answered his questions about the farm, at first in the shortest words she could manage, then by the second week in full sentences, then occasionally with opinions. The children helped, of course. Children always do. Mara and Thomas, let loose in a farmhouse with 2 small companions, became inseparable from Elspeth's daughter Bess and her son Kit within approximately 6 hours. By the end of the first week they were a single roving pack, appearing at meals in various states of mud and joy, and it was impossible, I noticed, for Elspeth to look at Julian with pure wariness when his niece was sitting in her daughter's lap teaching her a clapping game. I asked Elspeth once at the end of the second week whether she had always managed alone. We were in the kitchen, she kneading dough and I nominally helping by keeping the fire. It was past 9 in the evening. The children were long asleep. Julian was in the barn attending to a horse that had shown signs of colic because he had learned enough in 2 weeks to be useful there, and he had simply gone without being asked. Nathaniel died in January, she said, pressing the heel of her hand into the dough. 2 years past January, the farm was in debt. His people offered to take the children to his sister in York. She paused. I declined. Why, I asked. She glanced at me. Because they were mine, she said, as if that needed no further explanation, which I suppose it didn't. Was there no one to help you? People offered help, she said, the way people offer help. They meant it on the day they said it. By the following week they had their own concerns. She worked the dough in silence. I learned to manage. She had, I thought. She had learned to manage with a completeness and a competence that I found quietly staggering the more I understood what she had taken on: the acreage, the stock, the debts paid off and the house kept, the 2 children fed and clothed and steady, the old farmhand gently managed so that he felt useful without being taxed. All of it alone for 2 winters. My brother admires what you have done here, I said. She did not look up. Your brother does not know me well enough to admire anything. He knows enough, I said. She said nothing, but I noticed her hands paused for just a moment in the dough. The 3rd week brought the first real storm of the winter, not the grinding cold that had been with us since our arrival, but a proper blizzard that came down off the fell on a Wednesday afternoon with the speed of an ambush and buried the lane in 4 feet of snow by nightfall. Croft had taken himself to his cottage before it hit. The children were inside, the horses stabled, the house shuttered. By 7 in the evening, the wind was a solid thing against the walls, and the snow was coming horizontal past the kitchen window. Julian came in from the barn at 7:30, his coat whitened and his face raw, and reported that the big barn door had lost its upper hinge in the wind and was swinging half open. He had packed what he could against it, but another hour of that wind and it would be fully off, and the stock would be exposed. The spare hinge is in the tack room, Elspeth said immediately. She was already moving, taking down her heaviest coat from the hook. I can manage it, Julian said. You cannot manage it alone in that wind, she said flatly. You need someone on the other side of the door to hold it while you drive the pin. She was already pulling on her boots. He looked at her for a moment. You are not going out in this. I have gone out in worse, she said, which was almost certainly true. Get your coat back on. I offered to go in her place. She refused with a look that communicated, without a word, that she was not interested in accommodations. The two of them went out together into the howling white. I stayed with the children. They were gone for the better part of an hour. I sat by the kitchen fire with 4 small people pressed around me in various postures of sleepy concern. They did not like the noise of the wind, and they had been told their mothers and uncles were handling it, which satisfied them imperfectly. I told them a long, wandering story about a knight and a talking horse, mostly improvised, and by the time Julian and Elspeth came back through the door, I had lost the thread entirely, and the knight was inexplicably in Egypt. They came in together, and for a moment they just stood in the kitchen doorway, both of them white-coated with snow and breathing hard, and Julian's hand was at Elspeth's back, not guiding, not presuming, just there, the reflexive steadying of a man who had spent an hour working beside someone in conditions that demanded trust. She did not move away from it. It was only a moment, and then they were stamping snow from their boots, and Bess was demanding to know if the horses were all right, and the moment was gone. But I saw it. I have a good memory for moments. Julian was quiet at supper that night, not his usual silence, which was the silence of a man conserving authority. This was something different, thoughtful, almost private. He helped clear the table without prompting, which caused old Croft's jaw to drop when he heard about it the next morning. He carried Thomas to bed when the boy fell asleep in his chair before anyone could stop him, and he did it with the practiced ease of a man who had been carrying a small child to bed for 3 weeks now and had quietly learned the exact position Thomas preferred to sleep in. I watched him come back down the stairs. I watched him stop in the doorway of the kitchen, where Elspeth was sitting at the table with a cup of tea and what I recognized as the farm's ledger book, making her nightly accounting. She did not look up, but she knew he was there. "The hinge will hold," he said. "It may need resetting in the spring, but it will see out the winter." "Thank you," she said, 2 words plain and unhurried with no qualifying edge to them. Coming from Elspeth Caro, that was a great deal. He stood in the doorway a moment longer. "Is the ledger much trouble?" She was quiet a moment. "The south acreage will not break even this year," she said. "The harvest was short in August. I knew it at the time. I had hoped the winter sales would correct it." A pause. "They have not." "May I look at it?" She looked up then, finally, with an expression I could not fully read from where I was sitting in the corner. It was not suspicion exactly. It was something more like the look of a woman who has been managing alone for so long that the offer of help from a capable person feels like a thing to examine carefully before accepting. She slid the ledger across the table. Julian sat down across from her. He was still in the roughened work clothes he had taken to wearing, the good London wool long since replaced with Croft's old spares, and he bent over the ledger in the lamplight with his elbows on the table in a way that would have horrified his London acquaintance entirely. He read carefully. He asked 2 questions. She answered them. He read again. "The south acreage runs to what sheep last year?" "Wool and some mutton," she said. "But the wool price fell in October." "You would do better with a mixed crop along the lower southern field," he said. "Turnip and winter barley alternating years rotation. The soil type will hold it. I have seen it done on the Caldervane home estate." He paused. "I could draw it out if that helps, the field plan." She was looking at him steadily. "You manage your own estate accounts." "I used to," he said. "More recently I managed them badly." He said it without flinching, which I thought cost him something, and she heard it. "But I know what I am looking at in this ledger, and I think you could recover the south acreage shortfall in 2 growing seasons if you shift the use." A long silence. The wind had died somewhat, the blizzard talking itself down to a mutter. "Draw it out," she said at last. He reached for the paper she handed him, and they sat together at the table in the lamplight, his pen moving and her watching, and occasionally her finger tracing a field boundary on the map she pulled from the drawer. And the quiet between them was entirely different from the guarded quiet of 3 weeks ago. It was the quiet of 2 people thinking about the same problem, which is one of the more intimate things 2 people can do. I went to bed and left them to it. The weeks after the blizzard moved differently than the weeks before it. Something had settled between Julian and Elspeth that I could feel without being able to precisely name. Not warmth exactly, not yet, but the absence of the friction that had been there before. They moved around each other in the house and the yard with a naturalness that surprised me. She would tell him what needed doing without framing it as a request, because she had learned he preferred that. He would report on the stock or the outbuildings without preamble, because he had learned she valued directness above courtesy. He made her laugh twice in 1 week, which I do not think he intended the first time, and which clearly alarmed him the second. It was at supper, something to do with the field plan he had drawn, and a miscalculation about the width of the lower field that had resulted in his diagram giving the turnips approximately 40 feet of clearance on one side and none on the other. She caught it before he had finished explaining, and the corner of her mouth went first. Then the rest of her face followed, and I watched my brother look at Elspeth Caro laughing and do something I had not seen him do in years. He looked helpless, completely and genuinely helpless, like a man who has had the ground shift under him and is not certain whether he minds. He minded a great deal, I think. Or rather, and this is the distinction that matters, he did not mind in the way he expected to mind. He had come to Harrow Fell expecting hardship and enduring it with the grim competence of a man repaying a debt. He had not expected to find himself at a farm table in rough wool clothes, laughing at his own miscalculation with a woman who looked at him without any interest in what he used to be. She genuinely did not care that he was a duke. I do not say this to diminish the title or the man who held it. I say it because it was, I realized, an extraordinarily rare thing. Every woman Julian had ever known in London had known first what he was and arranged herself accordingly, in attraction, in deference, in angling, in caution. Elspeth had known what he was from the first moment at the gate, and it had meant less to her than whether he could swing a hammer in cold weather. What she cared about was whether he meant what he said, whether he showed up when he was supposed to, whether the work was done properly, whether the children were treated with steadiness and affection, which they were. Julian was a revelation with the children, patient in a way I had not predicted and warm in a way he had not, I think, known himself capable of. Mara and Thomas called him Uncle Julian. Bess and Kit, Elspeth's children, had decided on a different arrangement entirely. They called him the big man, which was accurate, and which he accepted with a solemnity that delighted them. One afternoon in late December, I came around the corner of the barn to find Julian sitting on an overturned bucket in the weak winter sun with all 4 children arranged on, and around him in various configurations. Mara on his knee, Thomas at his feet with a carved horse, Bess leaning against his arm showing him something in her cupped hands that turned out to be a wren she had found stunned by the cold, and Kit asleep, somehow, against his boot. He looked up when he heard me, and his expression was entirely unguarded in a way I had not seen since we were boys. "She wants to keep the bird," he said, nodding at Bess. "Will it live?" I asked. "Probably," he said. He looked down at the girl and the bird and the sleeping boy at his foot. "She has been keeping it warm." I did not say anything then because some things do not need to be said when a man already knows them. But I thought, you are not going back to London. You know you are not going back to London. You have known it for some time now, and you are simply working up to saying it. He said it on the 28th of December. I know the date because it was 4 days before the new year, and I had finally accepted that my lame horse was recovered, and the south road passable, and I was due to leave in the morning. And Julian had said nothing at supper, and the children had been put to bed, and I found him standing outside the kitchen door in the clear cold of a night that had decided for once to be still and starlit, looking at the fell. "Edmund," he said without turning around. "Julian," I said. "I am going to ask her." "Yes," I said, "I know." He turned then. His face in the starlight was the face of a man who has made a decision and is, for the first time in a long time, not afraid of it. "I have nothing to offer her in the way she deserves to be offered to," he said. "The town house is mortgaged. My London affairs are largely in ruins. I can offer her Caldervane, the estate is entailed and intact, but the income is modest, and she knows already that I am not a man who has managed money with any particular grace." He paused. "What I can offer her is this." He meant the work, the fencing and the firewood and the field plans and the early mornings. "And whatever I am beyond the title." "That is more than most men offer," I said. "She has managed without most men's offers," he said. "That is rather the point. She does not need me. If she chooses to have me, it will be because she genuinely wants to." I thought of Elspeth at her ledger. I thought of her in the storm, her hand flat against the barn door and her voice steady over the wind, telling Julian where to drive the pin. I thought of her at supper 2 weeks ago, her elbow on the table, telling him exactly what she thought about his rotation plan and why she disagreed with the east boundary he had drawn. "She wants to," I said. You are the only one in this house who hasn't noticed." He was quiet for a moment. "I am afraid of being wrong about it." "You are not wrong about it," I said. "You have not been wrong about her once since you arrived." He looked at the fell for another moment, and then he went inside. I did not follow. Whatever passed between them that night was not mine to witness. I know only what Julian told me, in the spare, factual way he had of telling things that mattered to him. And I know what Elspeth told me herself, later, in her own way, which was even more spare and even more factual and somehow more revealing for it. He found her in the parlor, the last of the firelight burning low and her mending in her lap. He said her name. She looked up. He sat down across from her, in the chair where he had been sitting for 5 weeks now. The one she had never said was his, but had never given to anyone else either. He told her the truth about his circumstances, all of it, the debt and the mortgaged house and the scandal and the ruined investments. He did not soften it. He had been in the habit once of presenting himself as he wished to be seen. He had lost that habit somewhere on the road to Harrow Fell, and he did not reach for it now. He told her he was not asking her to rescue him. He told her that the children needed a settled home, and that Harrow Fell felt more like home to him than anywhere he had lived in his adult life. He told her that he admired her. The word clearly cost him something, not because it was false, but because it was true, entirely and completely true, without performance or policy behind it. He told her he wished to marry her if she would have him. Not from desperation, not from calculation, but because the thought of leaving her farm and her table and her clear dark eyes had become genuinely unthinkable to him, and he was done pretending otherwise. And Elspeth Caro, who had managed alone for 2 years and had locked her opinions behind her eyes, and had watched a duke split her wood and fix her fencing and laugh at his own field plan errors, and carry her neighbor's children to bed with steady hands, set down her mending, and looked at him for a long moment. "You miscalculated the east boundary of the lower field by 30 feet, she said. "I know," he said. "If I correct it, will you defer to my judgment on the rotation schedule?" "Yes," he said. "And you will not decide things about this farm without consulting me first?" "Never again," he said. She looked at him steadily. And then, for the 3rd time in 5 weeks, Elspeth Caro allowed herself to be seen, not the capable, guarded woman who managed alone, but the woman underneath that, the one who was tired of alone, who had loved her husband and grieved him and built something formidable in the wreckage of that grief and still, quietly, wished for someone to come home to. "Yes," she said, plain as the answer to any practical question, plain as her entirely. "Yes." Julian put his hand over hers, the way a man puts his hand over something he has been afraid to reach for. He did not speak. He did not need to. I left for London the next morning as planned, though I confess I rode the first mile south at a speed that could charitably be called dawdling, and I may have looked back at Harrow Fell from the ridge for longer than was strictly necessary. The road south was cold and clear, and I thought about what I had watched over those 5 weeks. I had seen a man who thought his worth was in his title discover that his worth was in his willingness to show up before dawn and do what needed doing. I had seen a woman who had learned to need no one discover that needing no one and wanting no one are not the same thing, and that the difference between them is worth noticing. I had seen my brother, the Duke of Caldervane, on his knees in the cold, driving a fence post into frozen ground for a widow's farm, and I had understood, finally, fully, that the post was not what he was really driving. He was driving himself back into the world after the ruin had stripped him down to the thing that was actually worth keeping. They married in February, quietly, in the Harrow Fell church with only Croft and the vicar and myself and the 4 children in attendance. It was the least grand wedding I had ever been to, and I have been to grander by a very great distance. The church was cold. The children were restless. Myra dropped the small posy of dried flowers twice before they reached the front. Elspeth wore the best gown she had, which was not particularly fine, and her hair was dressed simply because she had dressed it herself. She walked up the aisle with Kit clinging to her hand and Bess gripping the other side of her skirt, and Julian stood at the front of that cold little church and looked at her coming toward him with an expression I will not easily forget. Not the composed face of a man receiving what he had arranged for, but the face of a man receiving something he had not believed he still deserved, and had, against all expectation, been given anyway. She reached him, she looked up at him with those clear dark eyes. 30 feet, she said quietly, which was not what a bride is expected to say at the altar, and which made Julian's mouth curve in a way that made the vicar blink. I know, he said, we will fix it in the spring. And they did. They fixed the field boundary in the spring, and the south acreage came right over the 2 growing seasons he had promised her it would. And the wren that Bess had saved flew off one morning in March and came back every autumn for 7 years after, which Bess maintained was the same bird, and which the rest of us indulged her in believing. The children grew, all 4 of them in one house at one table. Myra grew up with her uncle's stubbornness and Elspeth's pragmatic eye, and became exactly the sort of woman who will always be underestimated until the precise moment she decides not to be. Thomas became a farmer, which surprised Julian at first, and then did not surprise him at all. Bess became a teacher. Kit took on the management of Harrow Fell when he came of age, with his mother looking over his shoulder until he proved he could manage without it. And then she stopped looking over his shoulder, but remained very much in the next room if needed. Julian never went back to London in any meaningful way. The Caldervane estate was sorted out over 3 years, the debts settled, the modest income managed sensibly with Elspeth's eye on the accounts. He had no interest in the city after Harrow Fell. I visited every Christmas, and every Christmas I arrived to find him doing something no duke of my acquaintance would have recognized, mending something, or hauling something, or sitting at the kitchen table with a child and a map, explaining something patiently and incorrectly, which Elspeth would correct without looking up from whatever she was doing. He was happy, comprehensively, quietly, without apology happy. I asked him once, the Christmas after the children were all grown and the farm was Bess and Kit's, and he and Elspeth were in the smaller house on the fell side of the property, what he thought he had given up coming here. He thought about it the way he thought about things now, without hurrying. Nothing I was using well, he said. He poured me another glass of wine. Outside the window, the first snow of the season was coming down over the fell, soft and steady, covering the fields he had mended and the fences he had set, and the ground he had turned for her in that long first winter when everything he was had been reduced to what he was willing to do. Through the window I could see the light in the kitchen of the main house, where Elspeth would be, at the table, I knew, with some account or some letter or some small task she had taken on because she could not leave a thing half-managed. The same woman who had opened a gate in the cold and read a situation in 4 seconds and decided that children could not be turned from a door in November. Julian was looking at that kitchen light too. She knew, he said, from the first day, she knew what I was and she made her assessment and she let me work. He was quiet for a moment. I had never been let to work before. It was the greatest gift anyone had ever given me. I thought of the gate, the blizzard, the ledger on the kitchen table and his pen moving in the lamplight and her finger tracing the field boundaries she knew better than he did. The 4 seconds it had taken her to read him, the months it had taken him to understand what she had seen. Outside, the snow was thick on the fell now, the same fell it had always been, indifferent and ancient and beautiful. The light in the kitchen window burned steady. I raised my glass. To the widow of Harrow Fell, I said. Julian smiled, the full, unguarded smile that I had first seen in a cold November farmyard, on a man who was, at that precise moment, asking for help for the first time in his life. To Elspeth, he said, my wife, the cleverest woman in 3 counties. A pause, and the only person who has ever corrected my field plans to my face without apologizing for it. She was right about the 30 feet, I said. She was right about everything, he said. She usually is. And that, I think, is the whole of the story. The man who arrived in ruin and found, in the work of ordinary days, the life he had been too proud to know he wanted. And the woman who had managed alone through 2 winters and opened a gate in November to a duke with nothing left but his willingness to try, and was wise enough to see that willingness is worth more than almost anything else a man can bring to a door. The fell keeps its own counsel, the snow keeps falling, and the light in that kitchen window has been burning warm since that first winter, and it is burning still.